Right now, Russian forces seize military bases in Crimea, and Ukrainian troops, they plan to pull out. Is a Russian annexation now pretty much a done deal? What happens next in the tensions between Russia and Ukraine? And what, if anything, can the U.S. and our allies do as we speak? A special in-depth analysis that's on the way. And then the healthcare sign-up push enters the home stretch with a special focus on young folks. We're going to speak to a local co-founder of a group who's trying to sign folks up before the March deadline. And later, family issues in court. Teenager tries to divorce her parents from Jersey and stick them with a college bill, and the mother who locked the delivery room door to the father of her child. These are actual cases. We're going to tell you how the courts had to rule on it. We'll bring our legal team straight ahead. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening, March 19th. Now, it may not be a return to the Cold War, but the crisis in Crimea is certainly putting the big chill in U.S.-Russian relations since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, first tonight, we're going to focus on not just the latest developments in Western Europe, but also some of the immediate questions coming out of it. Now, following Crimea's less than official vote to break away from the Ukraine on Sunday and claims from Vladimir Putin that Crimea belongs, in fact, to Moscow, Russia is expanding its reach in the province. And now it seems total control of Crimea and perhaps even official annexation may not be too far off. Let's get the latest from our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman.
Well, Rich, Ukraine's security chief says his nation will now hold joint military exercises with the U.S. and Britain, but that may be just a show of force to try to prevent any further advancement by Russian troops. As for stopping the Russians in Crimea, that may now be a lost cause.
One day after claiming Crimea as its own, Russia is tightening its grip. Hundreds of armed Russian forces seized Ukraine's naval headquarters in Crimea, tearing down the country's flag, replacing it with a Russian one. The naval chief captured. Ukraine's military is heavily outnumbered in Crimea and under increasing pressure. Yesterday, a Ukrainian soldier was reportedly killed during an attack on a military base, the first death since the crisis in Crimea erupted. These incidents are increasing concern that the uneasy standoff between Ukrainian and Russian forces could escalate into bloody conflict.
We strongly condemn Russia's use of force in Crimea.
Traveling in the region, Vice President Biden reassured Russia's nervous neighbors that the U.S. will protect them if Moscow proceeds further.
We will respond to any aggression against a NATO ally. As long as Russia continues on this dark path, they will face increasing political and economic isolation.
The international community insists Russia will face consequences, but President Putin isn't backing down. Putin has vowed that Crimea will soon be theirs. We shall prevail, he said, because we are united. Glory to Russia.
Two late developments to report tonight. One, Ukraine now plans a full military withdrawal from Crimea. That could happen at any time. And two, a threat from Moscow. It may change its stance in nuclear talks between the West and Iran. Doing so, says a senior Russian diplomat, would be direct retaliation for U.S. and EU actions against Moscow following events in Ukraine. Rich?
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. Now, we've got two great guests to help us dissect and analyze the situation in Crimea, as well as really what's going on when it relates to Russia. Matthew Schmidt, he rejoins us tonight. Matthew, an assistant professor of national security and political science at the University of New Haven, as well as a contributor to Matters Military blog, hosted by the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. And next to him is Mike Lyons. Mike is a military analyst for CBS News Radio and affiliate CBS stations all across the country. He's also senior fellow at the Truman National Security Project in D.C. And helping me ask the questions here are not only Andrew, but also Dominic Carter, who you know very well. Okay, before we even get into the consequences in the short term for what happened, why did Russia do it? And I ask that because more than just a grab, I saw a choked up Putin on this. And there's history that has to do with this that I'm not so sure enough folks in the States fully appreciate. To them, this was about righting a historical wrong. Whether they're right or wrong about it, they felt that this was getting the ledger of history in the right kind of order here.
That's correct. What happened is in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev gave the Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This was largely administrative at the time because everybody was part of the Soviet Union. But after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine kept Crimea as part of its sovereign territory. It goes back further, however, because all of Ukraine, particularly Kiev, is the sacred ground of the Russian Empire, of the Russian nation. So you go back a little more than 1,000 years, that's where the Russian Empire started. In fact, Putin made reference to this at his speech in St. George's Hall the other day, where he said that Kiev is Russian. So this is quasi-religious to Vladimir Putin, to a group of advisors who follow an ideology, a doctrine called Eurasianism. So this goes beyond realpolitik, beyond hard calculations of planes and ships and troops and gas lines and things like that.
And how this is playing, we'll talk about globally in a minute, but within Russia, for as many unpopular positions as Putin has taken here and for all the challenges economically and otherwise within Russia, this is being viewed favorably among Russians, right?
Absolutely, right. So Putin's popularity ranking standing is way high right now. It's much higher than it was when he was most recently reelected, and there's no downside to him right now domestically.
Mike, for a lot of folks, they're looking at the map saying, when this whole started, all right, where the heck is Ukraine, okay? And why does this really matter? Give the immediate consequences, why it does matter, and it has everything to do with, as we're looking right there, from gas, oil, getting to different parts of Europe here, obviously the positioning of it. They're not NATO, Ukraine, but they were certainly a nation that we cared about and Western Europe cared about. Talk about the immediate consequences now and some of the security concerns and real nervousness that you're seeing among our allies in Western Europe.
Yeah, well, no question. First of all, Vladimir Putin turns to his generals and say, take Crimea. We need to take that from a strategic perspective. It has our Black Fleet Navy that's there, our only warm water port. If the government of Ukraine falls, that cannot go into the other hands. We can't ever negotiate that out. General Officer looks at the map, basically cuts a path along that kind of southern border, that border flank of Ukraine, and said this mission's easy. They could put this military mission together to do that. So I think in a lot of ways he took Crimea because he knew he could. Now you set the tone a little bit further, and you've got massive amounts of Russian troops along that border, along that western border of Russia, and into the north as well. And from a military perspective, you have what's called a hammer and an anvil. You have now troops in the south that would shore up any kind of formations down there, and if need be, troops from the west could sweep across into Ukraine and continue to threaten it. This is from a conventional perspective. Why are we concerned? Well, to the point is, you could have large-scale conventional warfare in Ukraine that would be massive destruction, lead to destruction of gas and oil pipelines, and really put the economy in a big whirlwind. Politically
and militarily, is there any motivations for Russia to go beyond Kiev here? Is there any rationale? They said, okay, we've made our point. We rearranged the map we wanted. We're done now. Or is there concern here? This is step one.
No, I think that they could go further. I think first and foremost, they would look to take more of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine in order to get a land bridge to Crimea. Also to capture a large number of the bulk of Ukrainian gas fields. I think that in the long run, you would have to be concerned about the Transnistria region, also to the southwest of Ukraine, and you have to be concerned about parts of Estonia, where there's a large Russian population, Lithuania, parts of Finland and Karelia along the peninsula up north, and then ultimately Belarus, which is basically functions as a Russian state now. I think when the current autocrat dies, the succession plan is that Belarus would become part of Moscow. I wouldn't be surprised to see that.
You agree?
Yeah, he pushes the West way too much if he goes any further. I think I'd have to disagree, and I think he's going to wait and see exactly what happens. But any more violation of that sovereign border of Ukraine could cause Ukraine to call NATO in. Next thing you know, you've got airstrikes, you have air reconnaissance patrols. You have a much more increase of a saber rattle to the point where the conventional forces in Ukraine start moving towards that. Again, Russia does not want to have this confrontation. They want to have this in a bloodless manner. Like they took Crimea, I think that moving any further across that border creates a problem.
You're talking about 1950s Soviet-style expansion that we haven't really seen since the beginning of the Cold War. Is there actual incentive for Moscow to do this, or are you just saying, based on the rationale by which they took Crimea, they could then apply that rationale and go into the Balkans or go into those other countries?
What do you mean by incentive?
Well, I mean, is there a natural desire for them in Moscow? Is there an economic benefit? Is there anything other than just, you know, a Soviet-era pride in being able to expand like that?
Yes, there's some. I'm not saying that they're going to do these things. I think, however, there's still a remaining risk that some of these moves will happen. For instance, I don't think that Vladimir Putin would move into Estonia because Estonia is a NATO country. It would trigger a NATO response. I think moving into the Karelian region in Finland is probably unlikely. I do not think that moving into eastern Ukraine is unlikely. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I'm saying if you look at what Putin's been doing, he's been following a playbook where every step he leaves himself two options. Doesn't box himself in. So he says, well, I put troops in Crimea or I didn't. I'm not saying they're Russian troops, right? They're these mythical figures in Russian uniforms, things like that, right? He says, well, we're going to wait and see what happens with the referendum. That leaves him a door. Depending on how the West reacts, he can either annul the referendum and not take Crimea, or he can act to take Crimea. He leaves himself options, and he is leaving himself an option right now to move into eastern Ukraine.
Mike, if you're Poland right now, again, there's one thing with, we can be, you know, mad, we can send envoys, we can do press conferences, but at the end of the day, nobody thought for a second that we were going to expend military power over Ukraine. Sorry. But all of a sudden, you got NATO countries, and you even hear concerns even in Poland saying, okay, you know what, we're not comfortable how the map's getting redesigned here as we speak. The intention was we were going to move a lot of our military assets that have historically been since World War II in Europe and start caring more about the Pacific Rim, right?
Right.
That's what we heard from Secretary Hagel and others. Does this change that now? And do now we start looking at some of those countries that are on the Eastern Europe side of it that are part of NATO, and now we got to fortify them a little bit? Is that the next conversation?
Yeah, I think it does change them. I always felt that what was called Pivot to the Pacific was really a marketing campaign to shore up dollars for the Navy and the Marine Corps, who lost their mission, just like the Army. The Army's struggling for a mission right now. But what you have here, again, in Europe is kind of good old-fashioned 1950 Cold War redrawing of the boundaries. Now look at Poland. Poland is probably the only NATO country that at least went on some level of alert when this happened. At least got guys out of bed. They took a look around. They made sure that they weren't going to have to fend off the great Russian horde, let's say. Now, again, in today's world, the element of surprise as a principle of war is gone. The world is very flat. You've got cable TV, news, so that's not an issue. However, you think about all of the strategic things we could be doing in Poland, missile bases that are there, preventive missile defenses that are there, that we say are pointed for the Middle East, but you know, we just turn those missiles to the east and they can be pointed towards Russia as well. So again, Poland's going to have a much more important role, I think, going forward here.
And this all begs a question, and we're going to get into this when we come back. What can we do about it? Some of the criticism, in fact, Mitt Romney said this week, hey, you know what? Pin this one on the president, pin this one on the State Department here. They could have and should have done more. We're projecting weakness. We're going to talk about that and more right after this quick commercial break.